The land out by the San Juan Hills had a way of seeming endless, a stretch of brittle earth and low, dying scrub that baked under the hard western sun until even the shadows shrank and the air rippled like a fever dream. Dry winds carried the scent of dust and mesquite, and when evening came, the sky bled out in streaks of red and gold, like some wounded thing gasping its last. Folks said no land was crueler than the American frontier in the late years of the 1800s, and those who stayed were either too stubborn or too forgotten to leave. Eden Hollow sat tucked in a shallow fold of canyons and sun-cracked ridges, a cluster of weathered cabins, lean-tos, and fence lines stitched together by little more than spit, sweat, and blind faith. 10 families clung to the place like burrs on a mule's flank. Cattle grazed when they could, and the soil gave up a grudging harvest if the rains came in time, though more often than not, they didn't. The settlement wasn't marked on any map worth a damn, and that suited its people fine. Trouble had a way of finding its own path out here, and a quiet life was something you bartered for daily, sometimes with blood. Annabeth Lee had grown up in that dust. She was a woman of 25 years, though the harshness of the land had a way of stealing softness from a person early, and in her dark hair and steady eyes was a strength earned, not inherited. Her father, Silas Lee, had once run cattle across the plains with a wild grin and a streak of recklessness, but the death of his wife and a dozen lean winters had thinned him out like old parchment. When his heart failed 2 winters before, it left Annabeth alone in the world, save for an aging mule and a stretch of land worth little more than what it took to fence it. She didn't complain. Complaining did nothing in a place like this. Days were for work, nights for mending and quiet. She mended what she could, rode fence lines, hauled water, and when a sickness took the last of her chickens, she buried them herself, with no tears and no word spoken. The one soul who seemed to notice she was more than another shadow in the settlement was Luke Mercer. He was a man half whispered about, a tall, leather-skinned figure with eyes like worn glass and a voice that could quiet a room without raising in volume. Folks said he'd been a tracker once, part of a vigilante outfit that rode against outlaws when the law was still a rumor west of the Rio Grande. Whether any of it was true, no one knew for sure, but there was a weariness in Luke's face that spoke of old grief and things better left behind. He came by Annabeth's place now and again, offering to fix a fence post or trade jerky for a loaf of her bread. Their conversations were few, but something lived in those silences, a kind of understanding between people too long alone in a hard world. That evening, with the sun bleeding out across the hills and the wind carrying the lonely call of a night bird, Luke had come by her cabin carrying something small in his hand. His approach was quiet, his step barely stirring the dry earth. Annabeth looked up from the saddle she was mending, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and saw something strange in his expression, a shadow of nerves, maybe, though she'd never known Luke to show much of anything. He crouched beside her and opened his palm. There, against his weathered skin, lay a silver locket, dulled with age but catching the last of the sun's light. "Found this," he said, though they both knew he hadn't just stumbled upon it. "Figured it ought to belong to someone decent." Annabeth reached for it slowly, her fingers brushing his. The touch was unexpected, a spark against the numbness of their world, and it made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt since she was a girl. She lifted the locket by its fine chain, turning it between her fingers. It was simple, old-fashioned, but beautiful. "You sure?" she asked, voice rough from disuse. Luke shrugged, a flicker of something behind his eyes. A man ought to have less to carry when the sun sets. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even a promise. But it was something, and in Eden Hollow, something was worth clinging to. She stood then, the locket resting against her palm, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The sky flared behind them, all red and gold and streaks of purple, and Luke reached out to cup her cheek, his hand rough, the scars of 100 old fights mapped across his skin. His thumb brushed her jaw, and before either of them could think better of it, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't the kind of kiss you'd find in a dime novel. It was hesitant, dry, the taste of dust and old sorrow between them. But it was real, more real than most things in a place where men died for less than a bad hand of cards. When he pulled back, his eyes held hers a moment longer, and then the spell broke. He left without another word, his tall figure swallowed by the gathering dark. That night the wind shifted. The horses in the paddock stamped nervously, and the dogs, usually bold enough to chase jackrabbits well into dusk, tucked their tails and slunk beneath porches. The air felt wrong, heavy with the scent of sweat and wood smoke not their own. Annabeth had just shuttered her window when the first shot cracked the night. Chaos erupted in an instant. The red-hand riders came down from the ridge, like wolves scenting blood. Their leader, Jed Carraway, was a name spat from the mouths of lawmen and widows alike, a man with a face carved from malice and a grin full of broken teeth. His gang numbered near 24, every man a killer, every heart blacker than the next. Cabins ignited in bursts of fire. Screams carried across the hollow as men fell, cut down before they could reach a rifle, and women were yanked from their doorways. The night blazed orange and red, flames licking at the sky like desperate hands. Annabeth fought. She clawed and kicked as two of the riders grabbed her, one leering through a scraggly beard, the other stinking of sweat and rot. Nearby, young Molly Trent screamed as she was dragged by her hair, while old Cora Boone, frail and gray, was shoved hard to the ground. Through the smoke, Annabeth caught sight of Luke. He moved like a man possessed, cutting one outlaw down with a rusted axe handle, then another with a knife pulled from his boot. But there were too many. One caught him across the skull with a rifle butt, and he crumpled beside his shack, blood darkening the dirt beneath him. "Luke!" Annabeth screamed, or thought she did, but her voice was lost in the roar of flames. A blow across the temple made her vision blur, and the last thing she saw as she was hauled across a saddle was Luke's unmoving form, his silver hair catching the firelight like a final spark in the dark. The locket pressed cold against her chest. As the riders spurred their horses and the burning hollow vanished behind them, Annabeth clung to one truth. Whether dead or alive, she would find Luke Mercer again, or she would bleed the red-hand riders dry trying. The night stretched on like a wound refusing to close, the land painted in shades of ash and ghostly silver under a reluctant sliver of moon. The outlaws rode hard, a line of shadows cutting through the scrubland, hooves striking sparks from stone and dry earth as they drove their captives deeper into the wilderness. Every breath Annabeth took was laced with dust and the acrid tang of sweat, the ropes binding her wrists biting cruelly with each jolt of the saddle. They passed through Shadow Valley just before midnight, a narrow stretch of land wedged between jagged cliffs and sun-bleached canyons. It was a godforsaken place, where even coyotes refused to linger. The trees twisted and stunted by hard winds, the ground cracked and dry as old bone. The night air was sharp, holding the promise of cold that bit to the marrow, and every rock seemed to stare down at them like an ancient, pitiless witness. Annabeth's eyes, sharp from a life spent scanning fence lines and watching horizons, took in every detail as they rode. She counted the men by the sound of their boots, the jangling of gear. Most were drunk or half-drunk, their voices slurred and loud, careless in their gloating. Two argued over a canteen. One fell from his horse and had to be yanked back up. Their recklessness was a thin crack in their armor, and Annabeth, bruised and aching, marked every weakness like a hound scenting blood. Jed Carraway rode ahead, his silhouette a dark stain against the dim light. His broad shoulders hunched slightly as if from an old injury, and the worn brim of his hat cast his face in shadow. But his eyes, when they found hers, gleamed with something far colder than firelight. Several times his gaze lingered too long, and once he slowed his horse beside hers, reaching out a rough, filthy hand to trail along her jaw. "You've got fight in you," he muttered, his voice like sand dragged over stone. "I like that." Annabeth met his stare, refusing to flinch. She let the defiance settle in her bones, clamping her jaw shut against the bile rising in her throat. She wouldn't beg, wouldn't cry, and she sure as hell wouldn't give Jed Carraway the satisfaction of fear. When he laughed and spurred his horse away, she let out a slow, steady breath, her fingers working against the ropes, not to break them but to loosen them, even a little. A chance would come. It always did. Back in Eden Hollow, the embers still glowed in the ruins. Beneath a half-collapsed shack, buried in ash and blood, Luke Mercer's eyes opened. Pain came in waves, a sharp, living thing in his skull and ribs, but he was alive, and for men like Luke, that had always been enough. He pulled himself free, coughing against the smoke and dust, his fingers brushing the blood crusted at his temple. The world spun once before steadying. In the flickering light of dying flames, Luke saw what was left of the hollow bodies, blackened beams, the scorched earth where homes had stood, and he saw Annabeth's cabin, burned to its bones. Memory struck him then, swift and unforgiving. The locket in her hand, the feel of her hair against his skin, that quiet, uncertain kiss, tasting of hope in a land that had none to spare. And the rage that filled him was old, a thing long buried and left to rot, but now it clawed its way back to life. He touched the old scar on his shoulder, a relic of years past when he'd worn a badge, when the world still pretended to have rules. The image of Jed Carroway rose in his mind, younger then, just as ruthless, a member of the very posse Luke had ridden with. And the betrayal, the one Luke hadn't seen coming. The night an entire town paid in blood, because Luke hadn't fired when he should have. It had cost him his badge, his men, and his faith in anything worth saving. But Annabeth was out there, and for her, he would bleed again. He gathered what weapons remained, a rusted pistol, a hunting knife blackened with soot. His bones ached and his head throbbed, but his legs held. And so he moved, his shadow flickering among the dead. The tracks weren't hard to follow. The red-hand riders were brutes, not ghosts. Their horses had torn up the brittle ground, broken branches and left cigarette butts, a torn scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Luke knelt by a print, touching it lightly. Heavy-set man, limp in his left leg. That was Pickett. Another print, light and narrow, Annabeth's. And something else, a ribbon snagged on a thorn, pale blue like the one she wore in her hair. A grim smile tugged at his cracked lips. He moved through the arroyos and ravines like a shadow, the old skills returning without conscious thought. Broken twigs told him where a horse had bolted. The scuffed dirt showed where someone had dismounted. His mind rebuilt the scene with every clue. The trail as clear to him as if painted in blood. Annabeth, for her part, did what she could. When one of the riders fell asleep in the saddle, she dragged her boot through the dirt, leaving a faint, crooked line. When she dropped a bit of ribbon, she marked the moment in her mind, praying it would be enough. She'd watched the way Luke moved through the world, silent, watchful, seeing what others missed. If anyone could follow a thread so thin, it was him. The night deepened, and the riders grew sloppy. Some argued over the captives. Others dozed. Only Jed Carroway seemed tireless, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He spoke of a place called Red Bluff, an outlaw town where lawmen feared to tread, and where women fetched a high price if they were young and still breathing. By dawn, he declared, we'll be there, coin in our pockets and no one left to chase us. Annabeth's stomach nodded at the words. She glanced at Molly Trent, pale and wide-eyed, and at old Cora Boone, whose breathing had grown thin and shallow. The women wouldn't last another day, and she knew what waited at Red Bluff, a fate worse than death. She swallowed hard and held tight to the memory of Luke's hand in hers, the faint trace of his voice telling her she was worth more than this place. It wasn't much, but it was something. And far behind them, moving swift and silent, Luke Mercer came on. He didn't stop for water, didn't pause when the ground sliced his boots or his head throbbed with each heartbeat. The night pressed in, thick with the scent of sage and old bones, and above, the stars wheeled like cold watchers. The trail led him through narrow gullies, across dried-up creek beds, where only dust remained. He saw where a horse had slipped, where blood had dripped from a wounded man. Every mark spoke to him. Every sign told a story. And in the back of his mind, the ghosts of his old life rode with him, men whose faces he'd long since buried, but who now whispered in the rustle of mesquite and the creak of old branches. He remembered their names, remembered their mistakes. He wouldn't make them again. Ahead, the trail rose toward a narrow ridge where the riders had made camp, their fire a dull, flickering glow against the rock. Luke gripped the knife in his hand, his pulse steady. his lips drawing back into a grin as cold as the night. He was coming, and hell was riding with him. The outlaws made camp beneath the looming shadow of Blood Moon Ridge, a jagged spine of red rock that rose sharp against the night sky. The moon hung low and mean, a bloated smear of crimson behind a thin veil of cloud, casting everything in a sickly, rust-hued glow. Even the horses shifted uneasily, their ears flicking at shadows and the eerie silence that settled over the canyon like a held breath. Jed Carroway ordered a fire built, though the riders grumbled at the risk of light. They were rough men, killers most of them, but even they had enough sense to feel when the night itself was watching. And tonight it was. Annabeth sat with her back to a boulder, wrists still raw from rope, her shoulders aching from the long ride. Corabun lay beside her, half-conscious, her face pale as bone, while Molly Trent trembled silently a few feet away. The fire's glow caught in the strands of Annabeth's hair, and Jed's eyes followed her like a wolf's might follow a wounded doe. When one of the outlaws, a greasy man named Rafe, stumbled too close, reeking of liquor and old sweat, Annabeth's temper snapped. He reached for her, grinning wide, and she lashed out with the only weapon she had, her knee driving up into his gut with every ounce of fury the long night had forged in her. Rafe doubled over with a grunt, and Annabeth surged to her feet, breaking into a run despite the rope at her wrists. She made it past the firelight, stumbling into the darkness of the canyon's edge, her breath ragged, the rocks biting at her bare feet. A few more steps, and she might have been gone into the black maze of arroyos beyond. But a heavy hand caught her hair and yanked her down hard. She hit the dirt, stars bursting behind her eyes. Jed loomed over her, his face twisted with anger, one hand pulling a coil of leather from his belt. "Was fixin' to let you live, girl," he hissed, raising the strap. "But you're too much trouble." Before the blow could fall, a sharp, unnatural sound echoed from the ridge above, a wet, gurgling gasp, then a heavy thud. Every outlaw froze. Even the horses went still, eyes wide, breath steaming in the chill air. Jed lowered the strap, turning his head. What the hell was that? No answer came, only the sigh of wind through the canyon and the crackle of the fire. Then another sound, a low moan, quickly cut off. Somewhere in the dark, something was moving, hunting. Luke Mercer had begun. He struck first at the edges, slipping through the night like a ghost, his blade catching the throat of a sentry too sluggish to notice the shadow behind him. The man's body was left propped against a rock, his eyes staring sightlessly, a crude sign carved into his chest, a jagged L. Another outlaw went to relieve himself behind a juniper tree and never came back. When the next man found him, the corpse was hanging from a low branch, boots swaying in the breeze. Panic spread like wildfire through the camp. Men argued, pistols drawn, eyes darting to every movement beyond the fire's reach. Jed barked at them to shut up, but his voice lacked its usual steel. Even he felt it, that cold, coiling dread. Annabeth, dragged back to the fire, kept her head low, but her ears sharp. She saw the fear building in the riders, the way their hands shook, how they flinched at shadows. Something was out there, picking them off like coyotes, culling weak calves. And she knew. She felt it in her bones. It was Luke. But was he alive, or some restless ghost bent on vengeance? She couldn't be sure. Jed paced before her, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. He crouched down, grabbing her chin in a rough grip, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Is this your doing?" he snarled. "You leave signs, girl. You bring this down on us." Annabeth spat at his feet. "You're a fool if you think I'd need help to see you dead." He struck her across the face, not hard enough to break skin, but enough to send a jolt of white pain flashing through her skull. "I could still break you," he growled, leaning close. "Sell you to Red Bluff, or take you for myself. Maybe both." Annabeth met his glare with a steady, unflinching gaze. "I'd bite my tongue clean through before I'd let you touch me." In that moment, something shifted. Jed's confidence faltered, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd faced defiance, but this felt different. Behind her words was a promise, forged in grief and dust, and the quiet strength of a woman who'd buried too many loved ones to be afraid of one more devil. Another shot rang out from the dark, a single, sharp report. One of the riders dropped, blood spraying the fire's edge. The rest scattered, firing wildly into the night. It was madness. They hit nothing. Luke took another two before they even realized he was among them. He moved like the ghost of some old war, his knife flashing in the gloom, pistol barking death in staccato bursts. He left bodies where they fell, never lingering, always moving. Annabeth's heart pounded, hope rising like a fragile flame against the dark. But with every fallen outlaw, Jed grew more desperate. He grabbed Annabeth again, dragging her upright. "You tell me what's out there," he shouted, his voice cracking. She smiled through a split lip, tasting blood and satisfaction. "Hell's coming for you, Caraway, and it ain't in the mood to miss." Jed hauled her toward his horse, planning to use her as cover, maybe even a bargaining chip. She struggled, digging in her heels, the rope biting anew. But she wasn't afraid now. A memory flickered, Luke's hand on her cheek, his voice rough but tender. "You're worth more than this place, Annie." That memory was a lifeline, a spark against the vast, consuming dark. Then a figure emerged from the gloom behind Jed, silent as death. "Luke." The old tracker's eyes met Annabeth's for one brief, searing instant, and she knew he wasn't dead. He never had been. Jed sensed it a heartbeat too late. The night had gone still again, save for the restless shifting of frightened horses and the labored breathing of the men who remained. Only 6 of the Red Hand riders were left now, and none of them carried the swagger they'd ridden into Eden Hollow with. Blood stained their coats, soot darkened their faces, and fear clung to them heavier than the dust. They gathered in a narrow canyon hollow, a box of high stone walls and crooked pines that pressed in tight, giving them one way out and no place to run. Jed Caraway paced the center of the hollow, his eyes darting to every flicker of movement beyond the firelight. Sweat clung to his skin, his fingers twitching on the grip of his revolver. He cursed the land, cursed the darkness, and most of all cursed the ghost that hunted them. Because by now, every one of them knew. It wasn't an army, wasn't some hired gunslinger or stray marshal. It was one man, Luke Mercer. "I seen him take down 5 men in a single draw," muttered one of the outlaws, his voice ragged. "Saw it with my own eyes back at Mesa Ridge." "That was years ago." Another spat, though his voice trembled. "He's old now, bleeding out somewhere in those rocks." Jed knew better. He'd known at the moment he saw those dead men posed like grim warnings, the neat knife work, the sign in blood. No one else moved like Mercer, and no one else carried a grudge that long. "He ain't dead," Jed said, almost to himself. "Man like that don't die easy." He barked orders, sending 2 of his men to higher ground to watch the canyon's mouth. But the land belonged to Luke Mercer tonight. Every rock, every scrub of sage and brittle mesquite, every crooked arroyo. He knew it like the lines in his palm, and he was already moving to spring his trap. Luke had scouted the hollow long before the sun went down. He remembered it from years back, a narrow death box perfect for a man who could outthink the numbers. And now, with the last of the riders huddled inside, all he had to do was set them moving. He loosed a stone from the ridge above, sending it clattering down into the camp. A shot rang out from one of the jumpy outlaws, the echo bouncing off stone and shattering the night's uneasy calm. Luke used the distraction to slip closer. The pain in his ribs flared with every breath, the cut on his temple weeping into his eye. But his hands were steady. He leveled the pistol he'd taken from a dead man and picked his first target. The outlaw nearest the fire slumped without a sound, a neat hole in his chest. Panic gripped the camp. The men fired blindly, shots crackling off rock, tearing branches from trees, but they hit nothing. Jed screamed for them to hold position, but the fear was in them now, too deep to scrape out. Annabeth, tied near a rock outcrop, watched it unfold with a heart pounding so hard it drowned out the gunfire. She saw Luke's shape, a flicker of motion in the shadows, and knew it was him. Even battered and bloodied, he moved like the land itself had shaped him for nights like this. Another outlaw broke, running for his horse, but Luke dropped him before he'd made 3 paces. Jed grabbed Annabeth by the arm, hauling her upright. His face was wild now, all pretense of control gone. "Come on, girl," he hissed, shoving his pistol against her ribs. "You're coming with me." She struggled, teeth bared, but he kept the iron hard against her side. Another shot cracked, one more of his men dead, and Jed dragged her toward the far edge of the hollow. It was there Luke stepped out from the shadows, his pistol in one hand, a knife in the other. "Put her down, Jed," he said, voice low and cold as a rattler's hiss. Jed froze. His eyes widened, a flicker of something like real terror crossing his face. "Mercer," he spat. "I should have finished you years ago." "Should have," Luke agreed. "But you ran, like you always do." Annabeth barely dared breathe. Jed's grip on her tightened. "You don't got the shot, old man. One twitch and I gut her." Luke's gaze didn't waver. "You remember what happened at Trago Pass? How you sold us out to the Silver Blades for a sack of gold and left our men to die in the gulch? I still see their faces, Jed, every goddamn night." "You don't know what it was like," Jed snarled. "We were dead men either way." "I made my peace with that," Luke said, a thin smile on his cracked lips. "And now it's your turn." Jed's finger tensed on the trigger. Annabeth saw a pistol lying half buried in the dirt. One dropped in the chaos. Hard in her throat. She kicked it toward herself, snatched it up with bound hands, and without a moment's thought, fired. The shot hit the outlaw behind Jed, the last of his men, who'd been circling to flank Luke. The man fell with a grunt, dead before he hit the ground. The distraction was enough. Luke fired. Jed staggered, the shot striking him square in the chest. His pistol fell from his hand, and his knees buckled. He slumped to the dirt, wheezing, blood bubbling on his lips. "You," he croaked. "You should have let me run." Luke knelt beside him. "You've been running your whole life, Jed. This is just where you finally stopped." Jed's eyes went glassy, and then he was still. Silence fell over the hollow. Annabeth stood there, the pistol still clutched in trembling hands, the fire's glow catching the silver locket at her throat. Luke rose, pain etched deep into his face, but his eyes found hers, and a tired, broken smile touched his lips. "Told you I'd come for you," he murmured, and with the night around them quiet once more, Luke Mercer holstered his pistol, took Annabeth by the hand, and led her out of the hollow as the dawn began to rise over the blood-soaked canyon. Morning came slow, as if even the sun didn't want to rise over the aftermath of the night. Smoke clung to the hollow in thin, bitter strands, the air heavy with ash and death. What few birds lived in these parts stayed silent. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of blood and scorched earth out across the mesas. Annabeth moved through the wreckage, with Luke at her side. There wasn't much left now, broken men, scattered belongings, and the quiet bodies of the two women they hadn't been able to save. Cora Boone, her frail hands folded across her chest, and young Molly Trent, whose face still held a trace of fear even in death. The ground was hard and unyielding, but Luke found a patch of earth soft enough for a shallow grave. They worked in silence. No words needed between them. Not in this place, not after what they'd seen. The sky above was pale and cloudless, the earth dry and cracked, as though it too refused to mourn. When the last stone was laid over the mounds, Annabeth knelt beside them, brushing hair from her face with a dirt-smeared hand. She didn't cry. The tears had long since dried up, but she whispered their names under her breath, a promise that they'd be remembered by someone, even if it was just her. Luke stood a few paces away, watching her with eyes hollow and rimmed with exhaustion. He hadn't spoken much since the last shot had rung out, since Jed Carroway's body had gone cold in the dust. The lines in his face seemed deeper now, the gray in his beard starker, like the night had stripped a layer from him he couldn't get back. When Annabeth rose, he was already tightening the saddle cinch on his horse. "I'll head west," he said gruffly, avoiding her gaze. "Always figured to. No call for me in Eden Hollow anymore, or anywhere else." Annabeth wiped the dirt from her palms, watching him as he adjusted the saddlebag, with hands that trembled just slightly. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the weariness in him, not just from the wounds, but from years of carrying ghosts. And she knew what he was doing, slipping back into the drift, the old habit of running before something could matter too much. "You think you can just leave?" she asked quietly. Luke hesitated, jaw tight. "Ain't fit for decent folk, Annabeth. Never was. Too much blood on these hands. Too many names I don't forget. He finally looked at her then, and the weight in his eyes nearly knocked the breath from her chest. I gave up believing I could be worth a damn to anyone a long time ago. Annabeth took a step closer, the wind catching the tattered ribbon in her hair. You fool, she whispered. Don't you see it yet? I don't give a damn about your ghosts. I don't care about the blood. You're the one who came for me. You're the one who gave me something real in a world like this. Luke swallowed hard, his voice barely a rasp. Annie, No. She cut him off, her voice firm. I'll stay with the one who loved me and kissed me soft. That's who I'm riding with. For a long, breathless moment, Luke Mercer, the man who'd outlived gunfights, betrayal, and the worst the frontier could throw at him, broke. His eyes shone with a grief that had festered for years, and the dam inside him finally cracked. He let out a ragged breath and stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, burying his face against her shoulder. I ain't worth it, he murmured. You are to me, she answered. They stayed that way for a long while, two broken souls, finding something steady in each other when the world had stripped them of everything else. When they finally saddled up, the sun was high, and the hollow lay quiet behind them. The outlaw camp still smoldered, the bloodstains already drying and fading into the dust, as if the land itself was eager to forget. Side by side, they rode into the horizon, the mesas rising ahead of them in endless waves of stone and sky. There was no promise of peace, no easy road. The land would remain as cruel and indifferent as it always had. But somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and the sun-blasted trails, a new home waited. And in the years to come, the story would be told in saloons and around campfires, of the old cowboy who came back from the dead, and the woman who stayed when she could have walked away. They'd whisper about the blood that stained Blood Moon Ridge, and the night Jed Carraway's name was buried in dust. But most of all, they'd speak of how even in a land that broke men for sport and left women widowed and alone, love could still rise from the ashes, quiet, stubborn, and as enduring as the western wind. Because some stories never quite die, and neither did they.